Hey everyone, welcome to today's video. Welcome to the Gaming Daddy channel. Thank you very much for tuning in. So today we're going to be talking about the Division 2. We're going to be looking at this particular perspective of the gaming industry at large and how it's influenced a lot of things. Gaming has changed from the past few years. I mean, right now we have consoles that are able to play video games at the same quality as a mid-range PC in many cases. In fact, in some cases, a console can now run video games at performance qualities that even some PCs from 2016, even 2017 could not achieve. This is a very big deal. Gaming has advanced so much that you're now seeing a lot of things change, I would say in many cases for the better, but then in some cases, these changes are probably, either too sudden or too slow. There are just many factors and many dimensions in one particular industry called the gaming industry that when you want to put your hands on everything, you really have to come back to saying, okay, what's really causing, a lot of these events, the shifts, whether they be in a negative trend or the shifts, whether they be in a positive trend. And when I say negative trends, I'm talking in the sense that developers are getting more and more hungry for dollars to the point where many times they're doing all kinds of weird stunts to try to get these dollars at all costs. The positive trend is the games are in some cases getting better and better quality, getting more and more ambitious, and providing more value at the end of the day for most gamers. And so these two things mixing together are like oil and water. It's just not necessarily been the most streamlined, hasn't been the most streamlined scenario because, some video games have come out where the developers have been really upfront, but then once they, or they open their arms to hug the community and say, we're here for you. But once they've made that dough, or once it's no longer as profitable for them to continue going on, then they eventually tell the community, yo, it was fun, but we're dipping out. Now, I'll talk about these scenarios and I'll point out to some of them, and I'll talk about the Division as well, because even the Division has suffered from some of these things. Even though the Division does have some unique aspects to it and it has a unique community as well, at the end of the day, a lot of the gamers that play the Division, also play some of these other games as well. So in 2019, we did see, in my opinion, one of the really silver phenomenons, if you want to say the silver age of video game releases. And I say silver because a lot of the games that came out that year were really big and ambitious games. Some flopped like Anthem. Some were okay for their communities like Mortal Kombat 11 and the Division 2. And then you also had some really huge, phenomenal games as well, like the Resident Evil game, I think, that came out in that same year. I think Capcom brought out Resident Evil something in 2019. And, the entire gaming industry was just, all over the place. People were shouting as to how gaming was doing well. Now, this is not to be compared with maybe, say, 2017 or some, previous years. I'm just saying, this was the last of the really better years that we'd seen in a while. So you look at the way a lot of these games and their communities, handled all of the issues, that also came with having new game launches and new releases. I remember in the case of, say 2017, Battlefront 2, Star Wars, where EA came up with this huge grindy mechanic and it did not work out for them. The community, in fact, went all berserk, like knowing and seeing exactly what it was that they were aiming for, which is pretty much they were trying to get people to play this extremely grindy game in order to push people into microtransactions and push people into areas where they spent more money. So this downward shift, the downward trend when they're trying to get their dollars, in a sense, superseded the forward trend or upward trend, which is providing value and providing quality for the game. And gamers didn't like it, and so they had to make a shift real quick. In 2019, a scenario like that actually somewhat played out very similar. The only thing was the devs were quick to quench the fire. And I'll tell you guys, Mortal Kombat 11 came out and they also, had this very huge grind, I would say, wall where you had to do all of this stuff before you could get simple cosmetics. The developers jumped in front of it and said, hey, we don't want you guys to feel like we're having you do this. So they basically gave everybody who purchased the game an upfront of all these in-game currencies and resources to be able to purchase, whatever skins or costumes, or in PvE, the augments that they wanted. Somebody told me that there wasn't any gear in Mortal Kombat. I just laughed and said, and this is one of the reasons why I usually compare that game, because you don't have gear, but you have gear augments that can actually add more of RPG-based stats to your character if you're in a PvE scenario. Maybe you're playing against AI, or doing some, or using some of these other mechanics to play in the non-PvP, segment of the game. So these things are actually there, and you as a player, if you don't engage in the PvP, you have enough to keep you busy if you're playing that game in the PvE. Look at the Division 2 as well. Division 2 came out, and, yes, we didn't get any of such, but before the Division 2 came out, the developers were trying to sell stash space. This is something that a lot of people actually said, hey, we don't want this in the game. This was one of those downward trend type deals. But then again, they didn't find a way to rebalance. So Massive dropped the ball on that one. They messed it all up. And so and I think this was a frantic thing. They didn't even have their end game done. And so they frantically said, okay, we're not going to sell the big stash thing. And so the people who had paid for the premium part of the product, the gold edition, didn't even really see what it is they paid for. People who paid for the ultimate edition and all those other stuff didn't really seem to have much of a difference other than a few cosmetic items for what they paid for. So they didn't get their value in terms of what they were paying for. And the trend showed that the company was trying to gain more dollars from them. So all of this has really shown that this new trend of having these kinds of open-ended games have, in a case, been poorly executed by these companies. Companies and corporations are there to make profits, and many times they'll do whatever it takes, even to the point of looking or even being very greedy to do these things. And how has this affected the gaming scene? It's provided gamers a lot of ammunition to remain super skeptic about these games, and created even more unrealistic expectations on the developers themselves. These developers cannot create the amount of content that they try to make people perceive that they're able to. So people are usually upset. People are usually saying, we need more content. But the reality is game development really takes a lot of time to do these things. DLC being added to a base game is not as simple as many may think it is. DLC being added to a base game will require for you not only to add the DLC, but make sure that the DLC does not break the game, or make sure that even after the DLC has been added to the game can still run in the quality that it was running pre-DLC. So you're going through an extra production process as well. So this is one of the really interesting things that makes it seem like, man, a lot of these corporations really need to go back to what really made gaming very important for, or I would say interesting for, people who participated in it even from back in the day. Because the more this trend continues, what we're going to continue to see is they're going to continue to employ more and more tactics, and it's going to be very challenging for a lot of individuals to be able to find any justification to engage in video games anymore. And what you're going to have is a video game collapse down the road. Now, this is not something that seems really likely, because, everyone's talking about these next gen games and all of the above. But the truth is, this is something that is very real, because customer dissatisfaction is very real. People will change habits, and people will change the ways that they actually do business with these companies. And to me, that's actually fine. I am the person who will tell you that if the consumer is one of the strongest proxies as to, in making changes, or actually making, these gaming companies or publishers shift their behavior to being more consumer friendly, even when sometimes they understand that being unfriendly to the consumer is going to make them more profits, but they find themselves in a position where they have no choice. But here's the thing. There is a genre of video games that's able to withstand a lot of this. And I think even a game like The Division is trying to tap into that genre while still putting another foot into this trend of, open-ended games with expansions and games that are able to, farm more dollars on the long run. And these games are the single-player games. The single-player games still have a very strong market. I know it may seem like all these free-to-play games and all these multiplayer co-op games seem to be very popular, but there is something to still be said about the single player franchise. Many single player games in the past few years have done a very good job, in keeping their audiences. You look at games like God of War, you look at games like, Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. Some people will say, well, we don't care about Star Wars games. That's you, but there is a huge audience for stuff like that. There are the Spider-Man PS exclusives that PlayStation is basically selling consoles based on. These are the games that will weather the storm because the way they're set up as closed ecosystems, games that may or may not have DLC, I think they really do have an advantage when it comes down to what they're able to offer the audience, and their players. And the Division is seeming to find its way in that sense. And you could tell because Heartland is wanting, in my opinion, is a game that might go ahead and focus on that, say, free to play, open-ended, buy more cosmetics and credit. It might be that game that does that, while they still keep a core game that keeps the franchise going, like, say, a Division 3 game that would have some sort of a smaller, offering, but still be able to demand some of the big bucks. And the big bucks, when I say big bucks, meaning players buy the game, and then support is something that is just the game being, worked on in terms of fidelity and all the others, but not necessarily putting DLC or extra content in the game down the road. Because as much as you may want to put it, DLC is very expensive. I mean, if DLC was that easy to make, everybody will be churning it out. Some people have even said that Destiny seemed to have stagnated, even though Destiny 2 seemed like one of the biggest DLC, droppers for some point. They were selling these $50, $60, $70 DLCs once, once Bungie went on their own. Everybody was so excited, but then it just came to the point where these DLCs didn't seem to be providing a lot of value down the road, and then the inevitable happens. And I think that's what's hit the Mortal Kombat community, because they just got their news a few days ago, and the developer said, hey, we're working on our next project. And they even went ahead and told them we're no longer going to be supporting Mortal Kombat 11. In fact, the Steam files showed that some DLC that was supposed to be in the game was removed. Somehow, somewhere, fortunately, the Division has not reached that point, but I also think the Division will more than likely reach that point. And now we're seeing basically the vestiges of that. The only thing that's keeping the Division quite fortunate is because Ubisoft is one of these companies that will continue to make sequels, but usually sell their sequels based on ensuring that their communities leave the prior game very happy. So they'll do all what they can to ensure that everybody is happy. Like right now, the Rainbow Six Siege community has already, many of them have said, we're not going to participate in Rainbow Six Extraction, but here's the thing, they continue to support Rainbow Six Siege. So I believe it's going to be very challenging at some point for Rainbow Six Siege aficionados to just ignore Rainbow Six Extraction. They're going to be happy. They're going to be in a place where they're like, this Rainbow Six game has not been, has been really decent for me. Why not participate in the other game? The same thing is what they're doing with the Division as well. They want to create content. They're trying to open the doors of communication. In fact, the word on the street right now is that they're trying to replace, the community managers who had changed positions. And so it's going to be at that point where they say that. But then I fear that after this, when it comes down to just making the small, few $1 million sales versions of the Division games or Division franchises, it's going to be at that point where they just tell us, yo, we're not giving you any more content after 1 whole year or 2 years. And then that's it. And I think what's going to happen is the player expectation that's been created in these past few games is probably going to collide as well. Outriders suffered something like that. Even when the developers tried to communicate saying, oh, we're not going to be having any of this stuff, or everything's going to be free and it's going to come down the road, people were still in their minds somewhere having the false expectations of, playing a game that looked like maybe Destiny or maybe like the Division. But then when the Outriders game loop finished, they were like, what? I thought this was a looter shooter. Well, yeah, the only problem is looter shooters have now been, pretty much infested by looter shooters that never end. Warframe, Destiny, all these other games. So, this is going to be a very interesting time to see what these, live service games have to offer. But again, like I said, I don't think they're really going to be here to stay very long, collecting $60 for these prices. In fact, the new, free-to-play model seems to be what they're going to be diving towards. But like I said, it seems like Ubisoft and Massive are trying to position themselves in both markets. But again, we'll see how this all plays out. But down the road, the single player game right now for me is still the winner. And I wouldn't mind seeing a Division single player game at some point. That's just me anyways, because I think it's really going to cut down on a lot of the dross and the excesses and the waste that you get to see even in a Division franchise in many cases. This is pretty much my opinion about all of this stuff. I just wanted to share with you guys. Let me hear what you think in the comment section. Thanks so much for tuning in. Peace out.